I'm David Bank, and from Impact Alpha, this is an Agents of Impact podcast.
So you see whole countries coming off of fossil fuels, and instead they're going to become dependent on Chinese technology. And they will electrify Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Whilst what is America doing? They want the world to double down on fossil fuels.
That's Mark Campanale, founder of Carbon Tracker and a longtime sharp climate thinker about stranded assets, collective action, and much more. My colleague, Amy Cortese, Impact Alpha's editorial director, caught up with Mark ahead of New York's Climate Week. They ranged over the role of China, Europe, the Global South, and where the U.S. now fits in. Let's listen in to their conversation.
Mark Campanale, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Amy. A pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great. So you are joining the masses, headed to New York for Climate Week this coming week, which takes place alongside the UN General Assembly, better known as UNGA. And in the past, it's tended to be a kind of an optimistic, almost exuberant sort of gathering of like hundreds of events around the city that happen outside of UNGA. But this year feels a little different, right? Like coming amid some of the very concerning global shifts and headwinds. How are you looking at this Climate Week?
People are going to be turning up with bandages and plasters over some open wounds. So there's a lot of people in pain. So yeah, you're right. Where is the optimism? I think realistically, everyone is conscious that there's been a big pushback the last year, 18 months. And that is affecting the sense of we can do this when it comes to dealing with the climate crisis. So there's a bit of pessimism because we know that policy drives everything. If the policy is right, investment will flow because you get certainty and you get certain policy signals and things, smart things like feed-in tariffs and permitting for wind and solar and so on. Now, all of that's gone into reverse in North America. But then on the other side, certainly in Europe, and I was chatting with a guy yesterday in London who works in the wind industry, he said, look, there's been a big collapse in the US, but the money's coming to Europe, the money's coming to the UK. And he said, we're booming in the UK when it comes to renewable energy. So there is the sense of pain of landing in the country of our, of our brothers and sisters. I mean, America is full of historically Europeans originally, full of Scots and Irish and Italians and Greeks and so on, and Germans.
Guilty as charged.
There's a lot of kind of like similarities in culture and understanding and education and so on. So we share that pain, but we also know that that this is a technological revolution. That's what's happening. So renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels, including without subsidies, with battery storage. And we've got to remember, like California has been running whole stretches of time with renewables plus battery storage without the need for gas. And this is just the beginning. And there's California, what is it, the fourth biggest economy in the world. So there's the pessimism that we can see, but then the optimism that we've got tailwinds behind us in terms of the technology, in terms of the breakthroughs in lowering costs and accessibility and strengthening the grid and making these technologies more efficient and smarter and cheaper. So that's working well. So it's a bit of a balanced picture. I'm coming with an open mind. I'm going to listen. I'm going to be talking to people, going to parties, going to lectures, doing a few lectures myself. So I'm coming with an open mind, and I hope to lift some otherwise gloomy spirits.
And, there's another little wrinkle in this, and I'm not sure if that's what you meant by people coming with bandages, but the US is very hard for a lot of people, especially from global South countries, to get into because of our visa policies. And now we have this additional layer of ICE scrutiny on people. Do you think that's keeping people away?
It is. I spoke to two people yesterday, one from Sub-Saharan Africa, one from Southeast Asia. Both of them would normally come to UNGA. Both of them said they're not coming because of visa fears. I had this very, very senior executive from a of a major insurance company saying that he wasn't going to come to New York because he didn't want his phone interfered with, is what his words were. He didn't want people reading his emails and his LinkedIn messages. So he's not coming, and I think that's fairly reflective. Some people are not coming because they don't. I mean, you've got the threat of deportation upon arrival, but not just that. You've got the threat of imprisonment. And then you've got the threat of people opening your laptops and going through it. And I mean, in the land of the free, it doesn't feel particularly free for people. Certainly not visitors. Certainly not people from the global south and from my people from minorities. And they then it's not just checking what you're doing; it's checking what you're thinking, and that to me is a major shift. It creeps up on people like it has it seems to me in the US that I don't think people are conscious of so much. Well, maybe you are conscious of what this really means because this is heading in a very very bad direction as we've already seen in the last kind of week or two of tragedy upon tragedy. But people can see where the direction is going. It's sad and apprehensive time, and that is also the wounds that people are carrying with them.
Yeah, so we have these sort of opposing forces of,
Mm.
the strong economic momentum and argument behind the plunging prices for renewable energy and climate tech and all of the innovation going on there. And that is I mean, maybe it can be slowed down, but I would say it's kind of unstoppable. At the
Yeah,
same time, we have these very concerning political headwinds, and you've got the headlong rush into AI and data centers, which is,
yeah,
ratcheting up demand for energy, a lot of which will come from
yeah,
natural
yeah.
gas and fossil fuels. So, and the thing about UNGA and New York Climate Week, it is a key milestone in the run up to COP30, which is in many ways the main event, right? And that will take place in Brazil starting in late November. And those, of course, are the global climate talks where world leaders get together and really decide the pace of climate action. So, how does all of this bode for Brazil, which is hosting
Mm.
COP30? It's a pivotal year. What's your take
Yeah.
on that?
Yeah, well, you've got the politics and then you've got the politics. So the politics around climate is you've got the national determined contributions. Each country is supposed to set its targets and announced plans to reduce emissions. And they're supposed to be submitting these plans pretty much annually or so. And then the cumulative commitments tell us whether we're going to get below. I think we're currently on somewhere between the 2.7 and the 3.3 degrees of warming trajectory. And it's the cumulative commitments of emissions reductions. And so that's the poor politics which you're talking about. Brazil and what happens in Balem and is going to be important for those commitments. But then you've got another set of politics going on, which is running in parallel. And in some regards, no, many regards, is more important, which is you've got the G7, supposedly most important economies in the world. And then you've got this new configuration of India, China, Russia, horrible, and Brazil, and a few other economies as well that are coalescing, particularly around the China-India relationship, which is very important to me. And what they're doing there is trying to create a new kind of locus of interest amongst geopolitics and the economics of what's going on. I think something else is going on, and I think, Amy, you've heard me say this. I think China wants to get rid of the dollar as the reserve currency and to unsettle the US dollar economy, dollarization of the global economy, by forcing out fossil fuels, which is priced in dollars, through the clean energy revolution, which China can dominate. So, what I mean by that is China is exporting super cheap solar and other clean energy products, in particular electric vehicles, not just trying to get them into Europe and into the US, where the list price of a Chinese EV is something like a third of of the list price of a US or European made car, internal combustion engine car. And they're exporting them to the global south, and they're exporting solar. Pakistan has installed, I think somebody said the figure of 60% of its energy capacity needs in 1 year through solar. And that's allowed them to cancel, and then through electrification, including transport, that's allowed them to cancel a whole bunch of LNG ships. We're importing gas. And so you see whole countries coming off of fossil fuels. And instead, they're going to become dependent on Chinese technology. And they will electrify Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Whilst what is America doing? They're trying to they want the world to double down on fossil fuels. And if you listen to Al Gore from Generations talk in the last 48 hours, their kind of annual review, which has just come out, he mentions how the US is bringing climate into trade negotiations, trying to force countries who want to trade with the US to get rid of clean energy commitments, to get rid of climate goals, to buy US fossil fuels. You remember that big deal that with Europe to buy US LNG and so on. But why would the rest of the world buy something which is more expensive? And once you've paid for your EV and once you've paid for your solar panel, it's essentially pretty much free energy for life. Whereas if you keep buying fossil fuels, you have to keep buying it and buying it. And once you've burnt it, it's gone forever. Whereas the sun and the wind is free. So I think China is onto a very smart game. And they're trying to reorganize the geopolitics of trade back in the favor of global south and through Chinese dominance. And so, with the US doubling down on fossil fuels, to me, is a fundamental error because you're going to lose because the economics don't work. And most of the cheap oil and gas has already been found. The IEA was talking about rapid depletion rates just this week on shale oil. And so, why would the US concentrate on an energy system which is more it's inefficient? 60% of the energy is wasted. Why would you focus on something which is inefficient, it's finite, it's expensive, it's troublesome because it sets fire to and it's difficult to handle when the world can electrify? And I think that geopolitical shift, in many regards, this drive to electrify the world and create electrostates versus petrostates, is probably more important shift than the relatively inconsequential politics of what's going to happen in Brazil.
Yes, what China is doing is remarkable, and I think we have to root for them. And as you say, the U.S. and the Trump administration, in particular, is on the losing end of this battle, which unfortunately will set us back quite a bit. But your point is well taken that the rest of the world is moving on, and it's being powered by cheap, affordable, clean energy, solar panels, cheap, clean cars. I have not been to China lately, but someone was telling me that, you go to Shanghai and it's so quiet, right? Because all the
And you
cars are
can breathe.
electric. Yeah, and you can breathe. Exactly. So,
Yeah, what's wrong? What can go wrong with that? Yeah, so
yeah.
this is the observation. So what do you do in this situation where China would dominate with electrification and create these electrostates versus petrostates, forcing whole swathes of the global economy potentially off the dollar? And what happens to the US? Now, the US has got all kinds of fantastic technologies, as we know, particularly in AI and microelectronics and computer power system storage and all the rest of it, which it will continue to exceed and better the world with that. It's other economies that you worry about, and I worry about the European economy. What's Europe got? I mean, the only thing you can think of is it's got its legal system and its financial architecture. And the legal system. I think the rule of law is so important, but when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to the old industries like steel, cement, unless it can innovate and clean up and cheapen its energy costs, I think it's Europe that's going to get squeezed potentially. And you've got all these other things going on. The horrible war in Ukraine and Russia, which is a catastrophe for everybody. And you've got the rise of the right, the populist right, following a bit of a US narrative there. But it's going to create a lot of instability, and adding on top of that, you've got the global South is already moving into the global North. You've got, I mean, Britain. We've got people from right across the Middle East, from from Syria, from the Kurdish parts of Turkey, from Afghanistan. You've got them coming to Europe, and then you've got the climate refugees coming from North Africa as heat intensifies, and people want to live in a kind of cooler environment. So there's all kinds of pressures on Europe, all kinds of pressure on Europe. So it's going to be an interesting decade. Well, it's already an interesting decade, Amy. I think it's just going to get more interesting.
Mark, you at Carbon Tracker have been warning about the, how much emissions we're pouring into the atmosphere for like decades now, right? You popularized the idea of carbon budgets and stranded assets, but we have not heeded those warnings. And in fact, most people, asset managers, insurers, are underestimating the risks of climate change in their models, right? And I know you're thinking a lot about that
Yeah,
lately.
yeah, and the event I'm doing at Cornell with the Financial Times and the Accounting for Sustainability. I'm in my talk this coming Monday is going to be very much on the misuse of climate risk models by pension funds and the bad advice they've been getting about what happens at higher temperatures as the climate breaks down. It is something we've been warning people about, and so if you're looking at a portfolio of a typical pension fund, there's two types of risk people think about. One is transition risk. What's the cost going to be for replacing this old energy system based on fossil fuels with this new energy system? It's expensive. If you're building electric arc furnaces for steel, and you're not using coal in the steel making process because metallurgical coal, or you're trying not to use so much of it, then you've got cement as how carbon intensive cement is. So all of this is expensive. And so you've got the transition risk of shifting away from that old system and funding the creation of the new. But the other risk, which I think is underestimated, that is the physical risks. What happens to the value of your assets, land, buildings? Just look up, the disasters we've seen around the world from extreme weather events, whether it's flood damage or fire, particularly fire, burning real estate and so on. Now, these so-called 1 in 300 year events or 1 in 100 year events, it's amazing how they're all happening, 1 in 5 years, 1 in 10 years, 1 in 3 years. So the tail is moving towards the middle. The so-called tail risk is now becoming a central risk. And that what pension funds face at these higher temperatures, even just around and beyond 2 degrees, where things called tipping points come in, the dieback of what's called the AMOC, which is the warm water that comes up from the Gulf of Mexico into Europe that keeps Europe warm. What happens if that slows down or closes off? What about the Amazon dying back? These things will increase physical risks, and then you've got the volatility of fires burning whole swathes of land and then water floods and so on. So these physical risks have been, in my view, and in many other people's views now, significantly underestimated because these could not just be like, oh, you have a bad year, then the following year is going to be fine. This could be a reversal for many years. This becomes the new norm with these tipping points. You move into a new system which is completely unpredictable, unknown. And that's where the real damage. And so the errors I think investors are making is that transition risk is more expensive than physical risk. And in my view, actually, the transition risk is a risk we could absorb now and make considerable savings to our economy from this new, more efficient energy system. But instead, people are going, oh, look, physical damage is fine. We don't want the transition risk. Let's slow. And so that's a warning I'm going to be talking about. So the one at Cornell on Monday, and then the event on Thursday with Middlebury College, hosted by Fordham University in New York. I'm going to be talking about nature and financial risks. So the risks aren't just to the energy system and to the atmosphere, but these are all potentially significant for nature losses as well, and food productivity, the productivity of the oceans, and so on. So this is kind of the message I'm giving. But look, the one big message I want people to go away with listening today is, yeah, it's expensive to get rid of your coal-fired power stations and your gas-fired power stations and your pipelines and your refineries is expensive, and you have to write this down. In Carbon Tracker, we've written in our the decline of the fossil fuel system that this is a $35 trillion write down of assets. But look at the upside. At the Institute for New Economic Thinking in Oxford, Professor Doyen Farmer, he's an American, wrote that the world will save 12, $13 trillion from this new cheap clean energy system from solar, because you're not paying for gas, you're not paying from coal from the other side of the world, and your sunlight is free, your wind is free. And so we'll have this new cheaper system. So I'm in the camp of swallow the cost today, but benefit from the rewards of cheap energy tomorrow. And that's the far more rational thing to do than enter into a period of catastrophe from climate, where the damages and the costs will become incalculable. But I'm afraid most pension funds are in the latter rather than the former. I think the job of think tanks like Carbon Tracker and our friends at Ember and the foundations who back our work, who are so important for the philanthropies who support Carbon Tracker's research, this is the positive message we've got to get across. And that's the main reason I'm coming to New York next week.
We have talked about where will the leadership come from in this moment when we desperately need it. And in many ways, it is the asset owners and the pension funds who do kind of get it and are taking that long-term view. And, we've seen examples lately of big pension funds dropping asset managers like BlackRock because they are not adequately considering
Yeah,
the climate risks. So
yeah,
talk
yeah.
about that a little bit.
Yeah, so we've seen, I think, unfortunately, what's happening is you've got like blue state asset owners moving to blue state friendly investment managers, and ditto red state. But think of it internationally. So you've got Europeans who have money at firms, whether it's State Street or BlackRock, and if for whatever reason they're not satisfied with their approach to environment, social, and governance issues, sustainability issues, they are firing these managers and moving the assets to European managers. And so you've got Europeans big asset managers who are taking this very seriously. I mean, globally significant, trillions of dollars under management, and these French, these Dutch, these British asset managers, and they're winning the mandates back from Europeans who've been previously allocating to passive managers, particularly in the US. And so, unfortunately, BlackRock seems to be caught between a rock and a hard place. How do they keep the US administration happy without losing their European clients? And it seems to me that to avoid going to jail in the US or being penalized in the US, they're happy to lose, 20, $30 billion worth of client mandates in Europe as the price for keeping their noses clean in America. So I wouldn't be surprised if that trend continues. Europeans withdrawing assets from the US. And it also goes into, this point I made earlier about the US trade negotiators trying to persuade the Europeans to stop incorporating sustainability and stop incorporating climate and it will affect the trade negotiations. There's been a pushback against European regulation. So it's going to get pretty crunchy to see how this plays out, because the Europeans are going to want to race to the top. They want the best quality. They want thorough transparency around these key critical risks, including climate. Whereas I'm afraid, dare I say, the American approach is let's sweep all of this under the carpet, and the Europeans are not buying it for a minute. And the US is pushing on the trade negotiations, going, got to give this stuff up if you want to trade with us. And I think that the Europeans are not buying it. It seems to be the way that I'm reasoning, and not just the Europeans. If you look for, a lot of people have said this, Amy, to me, and I think it's absolutely right. The ones today who are taking sustainability more seriously than anyone else are the Chinese, the Koreans, the Singaporeans, and groups in Indonesia, Malaysia. I think it's Asia, led by groups like Temasek, who are taking sustainability very, very seriously. And so you've got this kind of pivot. The Europeans find themselves in much better company with people from Singapore and Korea and China than they do in sharing tables with people who take very aggressive views, as we've seen from the US in the last 6 months. And that is a pivot which I must say I find very surprising, from my point earlier, that our natural home, our natural allies are literally our brethren, that are in America. The Germans, the Italians. I'm half Italian, as you know.
Me as
Um,
well.
well, we both are. So, we've got so much in common. It just seems to be so surprising that you've got folks in America taking completely the opposite view for reasons that don't really, unfortunately, stand up to the light of day.
Yeah, we just had two colleagues in Hong Kong and Singapore this past week attending conferences, and that message did come across loud and clear that they're willing to step up and be leaders in
Yeah,
sustainability. But along with the Europeans, I mean, it really is, Trump is forcing a sort of a global realignment, and
yeah.
hopefully the saner forces prevail.
Yeah, I mean, your point about the asset owners, the last defense, as it were, for these topics are the asset owners, the ones where they're making decisions for their members. And if the government, the administration, for whatever reason, tries to step in or use the courts to say, no, 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 we're going to take the decisions instead of you, that's going to be, I mean, a lot of people will push back on that, legally in the courts, because of course these assets belong to the members, they don't belong to the government. And these assets are administered under trusteeship with trustees who have to act in the interests of their members. And typically the interests of the members include a healthy natural environment to retire into, and they will do all they can to protect the interests of their members, and that's where the clash is. And so the leadership, from whether it's New York City or New York State or CalPERS or CalSTRS, is noted and welcomed.
Great. Well, we will be tracking this next week and beyond. And Mark, I
Yeah,
look
brilliant.
forward to hearing more about your events. And
Thank you. Yeah, my dance card is now pretty full, so I'm looking forward to spending time with the Sorensen Impact Institute and with the folks at Glenmead Wealth Management and with the folks from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. There's going to be so many good events and meetings, and the GIN is having their big event on climate technology. So I mean, there's a lot for people to enjoy in New York, and I just hope everything's going to be getting on fine and things will settle down a little bit in the end of this year, the beginning of next year. But you never know. I think potentially with this administration, with 3 years to go, things could get a little bit more bumpy than they have done today. But let's hope not.
let's hope not. Well, on that note, Mark, thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
That's going to do it for this Agents of Impact podcast. Big thanks to Mark, to Amy, to our producer Isaac Silk, to the whole team at Impact Alpha, and to all of you Agents of Impact. I'm David Bank, with gratitude for all that you do.